At the end of the 19th century, the world appeared complete. Not peaceful, not fair, but finished. Maps no longer showed large blank spaces. Every coastline had been traced. Every ocean route had been measured, insured, and priced. The age of discovery was over. The age of management had begun, and no one managed the world better than Britain. From London, a city wrapped in soot and confidence, the British Empire supervised a planetary system. Goods flowed inward. Capital flowed outward. Rules flowed everywhere. The empire did not rely on constant violence. It relied on predictability. This was its true genius. The Royal Navy guarded sea lanes, but it was British law that guarded profit. Contracts written in London were enforced in Calcutta. Insurance priced on the Thames decided which ships sailed from Shanghai. British courts settled disputes between foreigners in ports that were not British at all. This was not conquest. It was administration. To the men who ran this system, bankers, civil servants, lawyers, insurers, the idea that Britain could be challenged was faintly ridiculous. Rivals could exist, yes, annoyances could flare up. But the structure itself was untouchable. The empire was not simply large, it was embedded. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched all of this with a mixture of envy and irritation. For most of the 19th century, Americans had been busy fighting themselves and erasing indigenous societies from their continent. European powers dismissed them as crude, violent, and unsophisticated. A people good at expansion, perhaps, but not governance. But by the 1890s, something uncomfortable had happened. America had run out of land. The frontier, which had absorbed excess population, ambition, and violence for a century, was gone. There was no more internal release valve. The pressure that once drove settlers west now pressed outward. At the same time, America had become something new. It was no longer an agricultural republic. It was an industrial machine. Its steel output exceeded Britain's. Its railways covered distances European planners could barely comprehend. Its factories produced faster, cheaper, and at scale. What America lacked was not power. It lacked recognition. The global system still treated the United States as a regional actor, important but secondary. British diplomats spoke politely, but not seriously. British bankers invested heavily, but without fear. And that imbalance created tension. The American economy was unstable. The Depression of 1893 had shattered public confidence. Banks failed, workers rioted, farmers burned crops they could not sell. The political class needed something, anything, that could redirect anger outward. They found it in a place no one cared about. On the northern shoulder of South America, buried beneath jungle and mosquitoes, lay a dispute so dull that it had survived for half a century without resolution. Venezuela, Britain claimed part of it. Venezuela disagreed. No one else paid attention. That was precisely why it mattered, because systems are not tested where they are strongest. They are tested where they are ignored. And in the 1890s, a forgotten line on a colonial map became the point where the world's most powerful empire and the world's most restless republic would collide, not with armies but with language. The border dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana had never been urgent. It existed in the margins of diplomacy, mentioned occasionally, filed endlessly, and postponed forever. Its origins were murky, its geography unpleasant, its economic value, until recently, minimal. That changed when gold was discovered. Suddenly, the jungle mattered. British prospectors arrived first. They brought equipment, capital, and legal assumptions. The British government followed with paperwork. Lines were redrawn. Claims were formalized. The infamous Schomburg Line, once a suggestion, became policy. To British officials, this was routine. Empires expand paperwork before they expand troops. Venezuela protested, of course. It cited Spanish-era maps. It appealed to European powers. It made legal arguments. None of it worked. Britain did not respond because it did not need to. Venezuela was weak. That was the calculation. What Britain failed to consider was not Venezuela's strength, but America's mood. By the 1890s, the Monroe Doctrine had become a strange artifact of American identity. Declared in 1823, it claimed the Western Hemisphere as off-limits to European colonization. For decades, it had been more aspiration than policy. America simply lacked the power to enforce it. But doctrines age differently than empires. They wait. When Venezuelan diplomats realized Europe would not help them, they turned to Washington. Not because America was stronger than Britain, but because America was angry. They hired William Scruggs, a former US ambassador and gifted propagandist. Scruggs understood something crucial. Facts did not move governments. Narratives did. He framed the dispute not as a colonial border issue, but as a test of American sovereignty. His pamphlet, British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine on Trial, did not argue law, it argued identity. It told Americans that if Britain could redraw maps in South America, then the United States was not truly sovereign, even at home. The timing was perfect. President Grover Cleveland was politically trapped. Economic collapse had weakened his administration. Strikes and riots threatened order. Republicans accused him of timidity. He needed to project strength. His Secretary of State, Richard Olney, saw the opportunity immediately. Olney was not a romantic nationalist. He was a lawyer, and lawyers understand leverage. To Olney, the Venezuela dispute was irrelevant. What mattered was precedent. If Britain could act unilaterally in the hemisphere, then American power was theoretical. So he wrote a letter. It was not long, it was not emotional, but it was radical. Olney asserted that the United States was practically sovereign in the Western Hemisphere, and that its interpretation of disputes there was final. This was not negotiation, it was declaration. When the letter reached London, it landed on Lord Salisbury's desk like an insult disguised as stationery. Salisbury read it with irritation, then amusement. He dismissed it as legal nonsense. The Monroe Doctrine, he noted, was not international law. Britain had never recognized it. Why should it start now? So he did nothing. He delayed. He assumed Washington would calm down. That assumption would cost Britain more than territory. It would cost Britain the illusion that the rules were still theirs to ignore. Diplomacy is built on timing, not on speed, but on response. When Richard Olney's letter arrived in London in July 1895, it demanded a reply not because of its tone, but because of its implication. It claimed authority where Britain had never conceded any. It treated the Monroe Doctrine not as opinion, but as fact. Lord Salisbury understood this immediately. He simply chose to ignore it. To Salisbury, the American position was unserious. The Monroe Doctrine had never been recognized by European powers. It had no legal standing. Britain had administered colonies in the Americas for centuries without American interference. Why dignify a bluff? So the letter sat. Days passed, then weeks, then months. In Washington, the silence was interpreted very differently. Grover Cleveland and Richard Olney did not see restraint, they saw dismissal. Not of the argument, but of the United States itself. The delay became symbolic. Britain was not negotiating because it did not believe it had to. That was the insult. American newspapers began to notice. Editors asked why Britain hadn't replied. Politicians asked whether London believed it could simply ignore Washington. The question slowly changed from what is Britain doing in Venezuela to what does Britain think of us? National pride is a dangerous accelerant. Cleveland was not a warmonger, but he was a politician under siege. The Depression had weakened public confidence. Labor unrest threatened stability. His party needed an issue that could unify a fractured nation. Foreign defiance provided one. In December 1895, Cleveland decided to force the issue into the open. He sent a special message to Congress. On its surface, the message was procedural. He requested funding for an American commission to investigate the Venezuelan border dispute. That alone was provocative, but not unprecedented. Then came the sentence that mattered. Cleveland declared that if Britain refused to accept the commission's findings, the United States would resist by every means in its power any British attempt to enforce its claims. In diplomatic language, this was unmistakable. It was a threat of war. The reaction in America was immediate. Congress erupted in applause. Political divisions vanished overnight. Newspapers ran headlines predicting conflict with Britain. Public meetings were held. Militia units drilled. Irish-American communities, long hostile to British power, celebrated openly. The nation did not debate whether the dispute justified war. It debated whether war would finally prove America's maturity. Across the Atlantic, the message landed like a shockwave. British newspapers printed Cleveland's speech in full. Readers who had barely registered the Venezuela dispute now saw the President of the United States openly threatening the empire. The initial reaction was disbelief. Surely this was posturing. Surely the Americans would not risk everything over a jungle border. Surely the Royal Navy's supremacy would deter any serious challenge. Then the reports from London's financial institutions began to arrive. Investors panicked. British capital was deeply invested in the United States. Railways, bonds, factories. War threatened those assets immediately. On Wall Street, prices collapsed. In London, the consequences followed. liquidity dried up. Banks warned the government privately that a conflict with America would not be short, and it would not be cheap. The empire's global commitments stretched its navy thin. Concentrating forces in the Atlantic would expose vulnerabilities elsewhere. And then there was Canada, a vast, undefended border, an obvious target. A liability Britain could not protect. For the first time, British officials understood that this was not a colonial dispute, it was a systemic challenge, and they were losing control of the timeline. Empires like to believe that their strength lies in tradition. In reality, it lies in confidence. By late December 1895, British confidence was eroding, not because of American rhetoric, but because of arithmetic. The Royal Navy was powerful, yes, but it was scattered, protecting trade routes from India to Africa to the Pacific. Recalling those ships would take time. Leaving those routes exposed would invite rivals. Britain's army was small. Designed for colonial policing, not continental war, the United States, by contrast, had manpower on a scale Britain could not match. But these were secondary concerns. The primary concern was financial. London was the world's clearinghouse. Its banks ensured global trade. Its markets priced risk. War with the United States, the empire's largest trading partner, would destabilize everything. And instability was something Britain could not afford. The warnings came quietly. Bankers spoke to ministers behind closed doors. Insurance underwriters recalculated maritime risk. Merchants delayed shipments. Credit tightened. This was not public panic. It was elite alarm. Lord Salisbury convened his cabinet. Maps were laid out, not battle plans, but exposure reports. The question was no longer whether Britain could win a war. It was whether winning would destroy the system Britain depended on. At the same time, another threat emerged. Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II was growing increasingly aggressive. His navy was expanding. His ambitions were no secret. In Africa, tensions simmered. In Europe, alliances shifted uneasily. Britain had long relied on splendid isolation, the belief that it needed no allies because it had no equals. That illusion was collapsing. To fight America would require focus. Focus Britain did not have. Then fate intervened. In January 1896, news arrived from South Africa. The Jameson Raid, an unauthorized British-backed incursion into Boer territory, had failed disastrously. The raiders were captured. Britain was humiliated. Then came the telegram. The German Kaiser congratulated the Boer president on resisting British aggression without help from friendly powers. The message was explosive. It signaled German willingness to challenge Britain directly. Public anger in Britain swung instantly, from America to Germany. For Salisbury, this changed everything. The American crisis was dangerous, but manageable. The German challenge was existential. Britain could not afford two enemies. And so, quietly, without ceremony, the decision was made. Britain would retreat, not publicly, not emotionally, but legally. It would accept arbitration. It would allow the dispute to be settled by an international tribunal. It would preserve face by negotiating details. But the principle, the American claim to hemispheric authority, would stand. When Britain signaled its willingness to arbitrate, Washington understood immediately. The bluff had worked. The Venezuela dispute would eventually be resolved largely in Britain's favor. The territory, the gold, the maps, most of it would remain British. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was precedent. Britain had acknowledged, implicitly but unmistakably, that it could not ignore the United States in the Western Hemisphere. The rules had changed, and the empire that once wrote them had just agreed to follow someone else's interpretation. When the arbitration agreement was announced, it sounded anticlimactic. There were no parades, no declarations of victory, no humiliation ceremonies, just a communiqué. Britain had agreed to submit the Venezuela dispute to international arbitration. Newspapers framed it as a sensible compromise. Diplomats described it as a mature resolution between two civilized nations. On the surface, Britain had lost nothing. The goldfields remained largely under British control. The Schomburg Line was mostly upheld. The empire's territorial position in South America barely changed. But systems do not measure loss the way maps do. What Britain had conceded was not land. It had conceded authority. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had accepted that a foreign power could compel it to alter its behavior in a region it considered peripheral. Not through force, not through alliance, but through interpretation. The arbitration itself, held years later in Paris, was almost an afterthought. The outcome was predictable. British lawyers argued their case effectively. The tribunal sided with Britain on most points, and yet historians would later note something strange. No one remembered the verdict. They remembered the crisis, because the crisis revealed something Britain could not unlearn. That its dominance depended on stability more than strength, and stability could be threatened without firing a shot. Inside Whitehall, the lessons were absorbed quietly. No official doctrine was announced. No admission was made. But behavior changed. British diplomacy became more cautious in the Western Hemisphere. Disputes were settled quickly. Confrontations were avoided. The empire had learned its limits. At the same time, the United States learned something else. That power did not require conquest. America had not seized territory. It had not deployed fleets. It had not mobilized armies. It had simply insisted, publicly and repeatedly, that its interpretation of regional order was final. And Britain, facing greater risks elsewhere, had complied. This realization reshaped American thinking. If influence could be asserted through doctrine, if pressure could be applied through finance and narrative, then the old imperial tools were unnecessary. The United States did not need colonies. It needed acceptance. Over the following decades, this lesson would be applied again and again, in the Caribbean, in Central America, in trade negotiations and diplomatic crises. Always framed as protection, always justified as order, the Venezuela crisis became a template, but the deeper transformation occurred inside Britain itself. Once confidence fractures, it never fully returns. British elites began to see the empire not as an expanding organism, but as a portfolio of risks. Decisions were evaluated not by prestige, but by exposure. Where confrontation threatened financial stability, accommodation followed. This was rational. It was also irreversible, because empires built on systems cannot afford instability. And once rivals learn that instability is leverage, power becomes conditional. Britain did not collapse in 1895. It recalibrated, and in doing so, it began the long process of decline, not dramatic, not sudden, but structural. The world did not notice, but some observers were paying very close attention. Germany noticed first, not the legal arguments, not the speeches, but the sequence. A rising industrial power challenged Britain. Britain resisted rhetorically. Markets panicked. Britain backed down. To German planners, the lesson seemed obvious. Britain was vulnerable, and the vulnerability lay not in its navy, but in its economy. Germany drew the wrong conclusion. It believed that to challenge Britain, it needed a larger fleet. A direct confrontation, a visible contest of strength. This logic would drive naval expansion, alliance formation, and eventually war. Japan noticed something similar. It saw how industrial capacity translated into diplomatic weight. It concluded that power required production, speed, and modernization. Japan applied the lesson regionally, with greater success. Russia, slower and less adaptable, struggled to interpret the new rules. Its system remained rigid, its economy underdeveloped, it reacted too late. China noticed something else entirely. Chinese officials, intellectuals, and merchants did not focus on Britain's retreat. They focused on how it happened. No invasion, no revolution, no collapse, just pressure. And the pressure came from dependence. Britain depended on American markets, capital flows, and stability. When that dependence was threatened, even implicitly, Britain chose accommodation. This was not moral weakness. It was systemic logic. China had experienced the opposite side of this equation for a century. Foreign powers had forced concessions through trade imbalances, legal privileges, and economic leverage. The Opium Wars were not won by battlefield brilliance, they were won by control of systems. China understood this viscerally, and unlike Germany, it did not rush, it studied. Chinese reformers translated foreign economic texts. Merchants tracked trade flows. Officials observed how rules were written and who enforced them. The focus was not on armies but on production, not on borders but on bottlenecks. The question was no longer how to expel foreign influence. It was how to internalize its mechanics. China's response would take decades. It would survive civil war, invasion, revolution, and isolation. But the core lesson would remain intact. Power belongs to those who control the terms of exchange. By the time China re-entered the global system in the late 20th century, it did not seek to overthrow it. It sought to occupy it. Factories replaced gunboats. Contracts replaced treaties. Supply chains replaced colonies. And slowly, quietly, the same dynamic Britain had faced in 1895 began to reappear. this time with roles reversed. But that recognition would come much later. For now, in the aftermath of the Venezuela crisis, the world believed the danger had passed. The maps were stable, the markets recovered, the empires endured. What no one realized was that the rules had already changed, and the next power to master them would not make Britain's mistake of announcing dominance. It would let others discover it too late. For most of history, power announced itself. It arrived with flags, uniforms, proclamations, and armies. When borders changed, everyone noticed. When authority shifted, it was unmistakable. The Venezuela crisis hinted at something different. It suggested that power no longer needed to conquer to command. It only needed to shape incentives, to structure choices, to make resistance expensive. This realization did not spread quickly. The early 20th century still belonged to visible force. 2 world wars reinforced the idea that strength was measured in divisions, fleets, and firepower. Empires fell violently. Borders were redrawn brutally, but beneath that noise, the quieter logic introduced in 1895 continued to operate. After the Second World War, the United States emerged as the central architect of the global system. It did not rebuild the world as Britain had, with colonies and administrators, but with institutions, trade agreements, financial rules, security guarantees. These were not imposed universally, they were offered. Participation was voluntary, at least in theory, but once states entered the system, leaving it became costly. This was the Monroe Doctrine scaled globally. The United States did not need to occupy every region. It needed to define the rules by which regions interacted. Markets would enforce compliance more reliably than armies ever could. This worked remarkably well. For decades, stability followed, growth accelerated, trade expanded. Nations prospered by integrating into the system. The cost of disruption became unthinkable, and because the system delivered benefits, few questioned its architecture. China, when it re-entered this world in the late 20th century, did not oppose it. It embraced it. This was the moment many misunderstood. Observers assumed that integration would dilute Chinese influence. That participation would require conformity, that rules written elsewhere would constrain behavior. They were applying an outdated model. China did not seek to rewrite the rules immediately. It sought to master them. It studied trade mechanisms. It optimized production. It positioned itself where the system was most sensitive: manufacturing, logistics, scale. Factories multiplied, infrastructure expanded, supply chains reorganized themselves around efficiency. None of this appeared threatening. It looked like cooperation, but cooperation, when asymmetric, becomes leverage. Over time, the world discovered that many essential goods were produced in one place, that alternatives were expensive. That redundancy had been sacrificed for efficiency. This was not coercion, it was dependence. The same mechanism that had constrained Britain in 1895 now constrained others. Financial exposure became strategic vulnerability. Market reactions became political constraints. Governments could still speak forcefully, they could still threaten action, but every threat had to be weighed against economic consequences. Power had not disappeared, it had become conditional. And the condition was stability. China did not need to challenge the system. It simply needed to ensure that disruptions hurt others more than itself. This was not aggression, it was design. Those who recognized the pattern felt uneasy. Those who did not dismissed concerns as paranoia. After all, the system still functioned. Goods still arrived, markets still opened, until they didn't. And when disruptions occurred, they revealed how narrow the range of acceptable responses had become. The lesson of 1895 was repeating itself, not in South America, but everywhere. Only this time, the shift was global. The most dangerous moment for any system is when it appears stable. By the time dependence is visible, options have already narrowed. Alternatives exist, but they are costly. Reversal is possible, but painful. This is where the Venezuela crisis becomes more than history. Britain did not lose because it lacked power. It lost because exercising power threatened the system it relied on. Victory was too expensive. Defiance was too risky. So it chose accommodation, not because it was weak, but because it was rational. Modern states face the same calculation. Globalization created extraordinary wealth, it reduced poverty, it connected economies. But it also concentrated production. It rewarded specialization over resilience. Every efficiency gain removed a buffer. Every cost reduction increased exposure. When shocks occur, pandemics, conflicts, political disputes, The response is constrained by what the system can tolerate. Leaders speak of sovereignty and independence, but policy follows logistics. This is not hypocrisy, it is structure. The Venezuela crisis teaches us that power does not end when empires fall, it migrates. It moves from territory to systems, from flags to flows, from soldiers to spreadsheets. Those who control choke points do not need to issue commands, they only need to remain indispensable. Britain once believed the world required its supervision. America once believed the world required its leadership. Both were correct for a time. China does not claim either role. It simply ensures that removing it would be disruptive. And disruption is the one thing modern systems fear most. This does not mean the future belongs to any single power. It means the future belongs to those who understand how systems behave under stress. The Venezuela crisis was a warning disguised as a footnote. It showed that dominance could be challenged without invasion, that empires could retreat without defeat, that rules matter more than rhetoric. Most people never hear about it. Which is why it keeps happening. History does not repeat because leaders forget. It repeats because structures reward the same choices. When Britain chose arbitration over war, it preserved stability and surrendered primacy. When modern states choose continuity over confrontation, they do the same. This is not tragedy, it is trade-off, and it is the defining one of the modern world. The map may no longer be pink, but the lesson remains unchanged. Power does not vanish, it rearranges itself, quietly, around those patient enough to wait.